of Johns Hopkins University. He's a senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Institute at the School of Advanced International Studies. Always a pleasure having you on the broadcast. We've seen the market just gyrating. It cratered late last week, rebounded, went back down again today. Is this kind of yo-yo effect? And we know the markets don't like uncertainty. So the whispers are it's a trade war, boom. Whispers are there may be talks, boom. Now it's like we don't know which way it's going. What kind of impact do you think that will have on the White House and this whole incident?
You know, you're absolutely right, Mike. I mean, I tell you, if you've been watching the markets this week, you know, you'll have whiplash. I mean, last week, as you noted, was the worst week in 2 years, right? And then suddenly you get this pop on Monday, and look, we know President Donald Trump watches the markets. We know when he gives speeches, he touts the rise of the stock market under his watch. And you're absolutely right. Markets don't like this kind of uncertainty. And guess what? We're headed for more uncertainty over the next few weeks because of this uncertainty around trade and tariffs. And so therefore, I think it's going to have an effect on President Donald Trump, particularly when he uses that as a barometer for success.
We see him with saber rattling, but then we saw him kind of back off with the tariffs towards Mexico, and he was making all these exceptions and stuff. Do you think this is more of the same, or do you really see them kind of pushing their foot on the gas pedal?
You know, it's one of these things, it's kind of like, think about this as a New York real estate deal, because after all, he does come from that world, right? And that world, they tend to they make big bluffs, and they make big bets. And then they roll those bets back, and the deal is never done until it's done, and all sorts of, but in international politics, things work a little differently. Because you start putting tariffs in, and you start, then those are not so easy to do a line item cross out, and you initial the way you do on a New York real estate deal. So we are entering, in my view, dangerous territory here.
One of the things that we've seen with his predecessors, both George W. Bush and Barack Obama, they went with tariffs and then they backed off. And what we saw was, the U.S. saw a loss in jobs. It was counterproductive. And a lot of economists are saying the same thing. You end up shooting yourself in the foot. Will cooler heads prevail? I mean, are those kinds of voices there in the White House now? Because we see kind of a revolving door. You get the Bannon influence, they leave, then you get a different influence, now they're gone. Cohn, of course, one example of that. I mean, what do you see in terms of, I mean, it's difficult to gauge what's happening at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, but what's your sense?
Sure, you're right, Mike. Every president has a learning curve on this issue, and I think that when every president sees the numbers, they see that the American trade deficit with other countries is not the only important number, but it seems as if President Donald Trump has put this as the most important figure. But the reality is there's an enormous amount of foreign direct investment that comes into the United States. In fact, China is one of the largest foreign direct investors in the United States. Some of the tariffs that we're seeing come out of China, look, there's going to be pork farmers in Iowa who are not happy about this. Soybean producers in the American Midwest that are not going to be happy about this. And I think with electoral politics on his mind, at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, I think they're going to see the danger of going down this path too far, and they're going to come to some kind of agreement.
In fact, it's interesting you bring that up. Foxconn had talked about moving a plant to Wisconsin, $10 billion. It's going to employ a lot of people in Paul Ryan's district, the Speaker of the House, who said, don't do this. It's so integrated now, interconnected, this global economy. You can't just make these kind of cuts without hurting yourself.
You really can't. I mean, when you look at a state like South Carolina is a major auto exporter. But guess what they're exporting? They're exporting BMWs and Nissans and Mercedes, and there's all this foreign investment coming in. And just 2 years ago, China had a record-breaking year in foreign direct investment in the United States. I think that the more serious issue at play here, Mike, is there is a lot of concern in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue about China's strategy, and particularly industries of the future. Artificial intelligence being one of them, the big data industries. And I think some of this is a brushback pitch against China for, they have this artificial intelligence strategy that has a lot of folks at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue spooked, and their fear that they're going to be eclipsed by China in these industries of the future.
But it's interesting. China is putting down a big bet on this. They're spending a lot of money on artificial intelligence. Yes. Donald Trump's recent budget proposal, he cut federal funding for these sorts of things.
That's right. That's right. And so, it's probably better for America to compete than to try to prevent others from doing, what they're doing. And frankly, the American private sector is the most dynamic, vibrant, innovative private sector in the world. The American private sector can compete with any state subsidized company. And I think that this idea that the American private sector has to be sheltered or protected goes against the very essence of what the American economy is all about.
It's interesting. We of course saw the opening volleys of all of this with the solar panels, the washing machine tariffs. That was a while back. Right. Then came the steel and aluminum tariffs. And it's interesting, China has come back with their own tariffs. The U.S., this is a headline from a newspaper, the U.S. wine industry could get squished in the tariff fight. Planning to impose tariffs on U.S. wine in response to the steel tariffs. One winemaker, Vern Vieira in California, said this, and I want to get his quote just right. We're not going to go with this. The agricultural community in the U.S. is going to pressure politicians in Washington, D.C. to stop the tariffs on aluminum and steel. Right. Going at agriculture, and obviously there's Iowa farmers who were in China lobbying. They're worried about the sorghum exports. Yeah. That's Trump's constituency. Yes. So he's trying to protect one constituency, but the other could be impacted.
That's a really good point. Wine, fruits, nuts, as we said, pork. I mean, look, 10% of U.S. pork exports go to China. You know, wine, it may be a small amount. It's about 5% of U.S. wine exports now head to China. But it's a very rapidly growing middle class and rapidly growing middle class of wine consumers. So it's a really an important growing market. So you're absolutely right, Mike. I mean, this is, again, let's go back to electoral politics here. There's some pretty important, early states, in primaries that President Trump is hurting here. And he's hurting agricultural states in particular.
It's interesting we have this guy saying they're not going to go for this. They're going to put pressure on politicians. Give us a sense of what happens, because the list is going to come out. We don't know what's going to be on the list. These are potential targets. And then there's a 30-day listening period. Yeah. Obviously, if you're going to be impacted, like this winemaker, you're going to start saying something about this. So what happens? I mean, it's that 30-day period. Do you see some things coming off the table, or?
I do. I mean, I think what we're seeing from the statements of Steven Mnuchin, and I think what we're seeing, you can almost take the NAFTA negotiations as an example here, where there was a lot of bluster and a lot of talk. And guess what? Agricultural producers went to President Trump's team and said, hey, guys, NAFTA is pretty good for us. This is going to hurt us if you rip up the NAFTA deal. And then, gradually we're heading toward a NAFTA conclusion that is not going to be a dramatically different deal. And the other example might be South Korea. There's a deal that was just done. South Korea got an exemption on steel. The only exemption is that they can send 70% of the steel that they're currently sending to the United States. And South Korea opened up the U.S. the autos of the U.S. exports to South Korea. But the U.S. is not selling that many autos. So in Seoul, they're saying, hey, we got a pretty good deal out of this. So there's a lot of examples out there that we could see that it won't go to, Mach 3, as they say.
Well, let's hope not. And always a pleasure talking to you. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you.